What defines the greatest of all time in baseball, and could Julio Rodriguez check those boxes? We're going to explore that a little bit, as well as talk some more Robbie Ray and reflect back on the James Paxton trade here on the Locked On Mariners podcast. Colby, hit it.
You are Locked On Mariners, your daily Seattle Mariners podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
It is Wednesday, February 8th, 2023. This is Trident Gonzalez and Colby Patnode for the Locked On Mariners podcast, brought to you by FanDuel, the official sportsbook of the Locked On Podcast Network. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Thank you so much for making us your first listen. Subscribe, like, and turn on alerts if you're watching on YouTube, or subscribe and leave a 5-star review on your preferred podcast platform if you like what you hear. And if you want to hear from us even more, please consider signing up for our Patreon. The link, as well as our social accounts, is in the description below. On the show today, we want to talk about Robbie Ray some more and why fans might be overlooking just how good he could be in 2023. And we'll also look back on the trade that sent James Paxton to the Yankees ahead of 2019 and tell you how we feel about it now that, Erik Swanson has been traded and Justus Sheffield is no longer on the 40-man roster. We actually got asked a question about that a few weeks ago. We were supposed to get to it on a mailbag episode, but I spaced. And so, but we're going to get to it today. But before we get into that, Colby, I want to start here. Last night we saw in the NBA, LeBron James broke the all-time scoring record, and it's once again brought up the age-old conversation that we hear every single minute of every single day on Sports Network of who's the greatest of all time? Is it LeBron? Is it MJ? Is it Kobe? Blah, 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 blah. I find it very tiring. But I also don't really see this conversation being had in baseball, when these two conversations are really not too dissimilar, because one of the main driving forces of this debate in the NBA is the difference between eras. And obviously there is a vast difference between eras in baseball, and baseball in general just has a longer history and predates the NBA by decades and decades. But it's evolved so much over time. So, I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are on how much era impacts the conversation around the greatest of all time in baseball, and what essentially you value when you think about the greatest of all time. Is it just the numbers? Is it purely just the numbers, or does a player have to, maybe do something a little more unique to them? Do they have to set a record or do something like Ohtani, where, maybe Ohtani isn't necessarily elite at hitting or pitching, but he's very, 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 very good at both, and that's what makes him an elite player? Or is it, does it even go beyond that and more so talk about iconography and popularity? Because maybe the answer there is Babe Ruth, or is it longevity and staying power? And that, of course, can kind of work both ways, or it can be argued both ways as well, because like right now in the NBA, the discussion about LeBron is like, he wouldn't have had that opportunity to break the scoring record if he wasn't playing, 20 plus years in the league. So does that impact the conversation for you as well? And just to take it one step further here and add a Mariners element to it, because, we are a Mariners podcast, of course. Do any of those traits or qualities that you value show up in Julio Rodriguez?
Well, 3 minutes, 40 seconds, new record. First of all, the correct answer is LeBron James. But when you kind of discuss, particularly era, like how do you value that? It's different, because one thing I'm 100% confident about is that if you picked up Babe Ruth in his prime and you dropped him into the 2023 game, he would not be a major leaguer, let alone in the discussion for greatest of all time. The athletes are so much better. The athletes are better now than they were even 20 years ago. It's just insane. The breaking stuff is better. So it's tough, but you still have to consider Babe Ruth as part of the greatest of all time competition, because the numbers bear it out. So you kind of have this balancing act of, like, is there any chance Babe Ruth is even Daniel Vogelback in 2023? No, probably not. I don't think Babe Ruth touches a baseball, but that doesn't mean that he wasn't great in his era and wasn't the greatest of all time for probably a majority of baseball's history. So you kind of have this balancing act that you're trying to figure out. It's a difficult act to put together. But I think there is something you kind of have to have, this persona about you, whether it's positive or negative. You have to have some kind of like you have to create some kind of like hard feelings, either one way or the other. You have to put up the numbers. That's a big part of it. And I think you have to excel at multiple aspects of the game. You're not the greatest, basketball player of all time because you just have the most rebounds, right? That's not how it works. You have to score, you have to rebound, you have to pass the ball, you have to play defense. And the same kind of goes, for baseball. So, I would stop well short of saying Julio is on track to be the greatest of all time, but he does have a lot of those attributes that would lend him some, some paths to get into that conversation, but it's highly unlikely. But it's a little bit of everything. You just kind of have to take it all in, and really what it's about is it's just personal preference at the end of the day.
Sure.
There is no correct answer, right? I mean, people get up, Brady's the greatest of all time, and then there's always going to be like, well, actually it's Jerry Rice, and then actually it's Lawrence Taylor, because you guys are forgetting deep, blah 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 blah. It's really just about preference. What do you value? What do you think about? Because you know what, honestly, the LeBron, Kobe, MJ question, there is no right answer. And that's the trick to the whole thing.
Right. And that's the thing too, right? That I feel a lot of people, whenever we're talking about the greatest of anything of all time, really, it doesn't even just have to be sports. It can be music. It can be video games. It can be what have you, right? That a lot of this is driven by point of reference and personal preference overall, right? And that and that should be separate from objectively, from the objective here, and from objectively speaking on the topic as well, because that takes a lot of diving into, and that takes a lot of context, and that's just such a deep conversation that I think only a handful of people are truly capable of having. And then for the rest, I think it's just down to personal preference. Now, you and I have talked quite a bit on here about arguably, Shohei Ohtani is the greatest of all time, and Mike Trout is the greatest of all time. And but you make a good point here that I think these guys need to transcend the game in order for them to be the greatest of all time. And while at the core of it, Mike Trout might be very well the greatest baseball player of all time for everything that he's done over the last decade plus, but the fact that really, we talked about this during our marketability discussion on Monday, that hardly anyone that doesn't watch the game knows who Mike Trout is. But you say Babe Ruth, people know who Babe Ruth is. People know who Barry Bonds is,
Right, and it's whether they have strong feelings of positive or negative about them, they know who they are. We sit here and we say Kobe, and everybody knows exactly who we're talking about. We say LeBron, everybody knows exactly who we're talking about. We say Brady, there's not which one, right? We all know who we're talking about. And so Trout is maybe the most talented player of all time, considering that he's playing in the hardest era to play in and he's dominating it. But Ohtani, obviously, with the pitching and the hitting, we'll see how long he can keep that up. And the one other thing that is, always going to color these discussions is, which era did you grow up watching? You know what I mean? So there, obviously, if you grew up watching and rooting for Willie Mays, you're probably going to say Willie Mays is the greatest of all time.
Yeah.
And I mean, did Willie Mays transcend the game? Yeah, he did. So, to me, greatest of all time is always one of those things where it's like, it's literally a topic that is set up to be divisive. Like that's the only value it has. Because ultimately, who's the greatest basketball player of all time could not matter less.
Right.
Same goes for baseball.
They're all great. Doesn't matter. Yeah. We don't need to pick one over the other, because like at that point too, you're nitpicking things because they're so great. You have to choosing things.
Right. You're choosing what you care about, what you don't, and you're kind of making leaps. Like, well, Jordan played in this era. He wouldn't be the best athlete on the court anymore. He'd just be kind of an average guy. Blah blah blah. And hey, could Babe Ruth hit an Andres Munoz fastball? Probably not. So. It's just one of those things where you kind of have to float between realities, and you have to make major assumptions, particularly in baseball, when you are comparing guys across different eras and different games with different player pools that they're facing. Like, there's so many variables that work both for and against certain players that it really is just a topic that is meant to be divisive. And I will play my part. Barry Bonds is the best baseball player of all time.
I agree. And that goes back to what you were saying about the era that you grew up watching, right? I grew up watching that era of baseball, and yeah, it's the steroid era, and yeah, we're gonna catch a lot of flack for saying that Barry Bonds is the greatest player of all time, but you
Hit
think
more
about
home
someone
runs, drew more walks, highest
and
on base
and
percentage, Gold
and the
Gloves,
steroid
MVPs.
and the steroid note, quite frankly, to me, is an oversimplification of a much, much, much deeper conversation. One that maybe we could eventually have on maybe our Patreon show. Maybe that would be a little bit better of a forum for that than here. But yeah, it's. I think Barry Bonds to me checked all those boxes that I want from the greatest player of all time. And yeah, you want to acknowledge the steroid stuff, but also, just to quickly touch on this, a lot of other people in the league at the same time were doing the same exact thing that he was. So the playing field was more it was more even than a lot of people want to admit at the time. And also there's so much more that goes into making Barry Bonds the player that he was beyond just taking steroids. A lot of dudes juiced, and they were not even nearly as good as Barry Bonds was. And Barry Bonds before the juicing was also a really freaking good ball player.
He was going to be a 500 home run, 500 stolen base guy before he juiced. So yeah, it's just one of those things. But I think about Barry Bonds. I think about how he literally changed how pitchers had to attack an entire lineup. Like his presence in the middle of that order was so dangerous that people intentionally walked him with the bases loaded. Like that's what we're talking about here. That's the kind of impact he had on the game. And yeah, unfortunately, he was kind of hostile, let's say, to the media, and a lot of people didn't like him for that. And obviously the steroids thing also didn't help, but yeah, he does have kind of a I think the very baseline here is, can you write the history of the sport without mentioning this player? And if the answer is yes, then he's not in the discussion for the GOAT. And as much as you may hate or like Bonds or not care about him like we do, you cannot tell the story of Major League Baseball and not devote a huge portion of it to Barry Bonds.
I got one last question to ask you about this. Then we'll get into some Robbie Ray stuff. We'll get into the James Paxton trade and reflect on that a little bit here. But first, let's tell the folks about FanDuel. We're really excited about our new sports betting partner for Locked On because they're the #1 sportsbook in America, FanDuel. And if you're new to FanDuel, that's even better. They have so many great features that make betting on sports fun and easy. Download FanDuel now so you can bet on Super Bowl 57 with a no-sweat first bet. You'll get up to $3,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. FanDuel lets you bet on everything from the money line to point spreads to who will score a touchdown. Last time the Eagles were in the Super Bowl, Nick Foles, of course, caught a touchdown pass, and right now a touchdown reception by any quarterback this Sunday sits at plus 5,000 on FanDuel. And it's the Super Bowl. Things are going to get at least a little bit weird, so I might look into that. The FanDuel Sportsbook app is safe, secure, and super easy to use. Best of all, you can get paid your winnings instantly. So join FanDuel today at FanDuel.com/lockedon to claim your no sweat first bet on Super Bowl 57. That's FanDuel.com/LOCKEDON. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sportsbook partner of the NFL. You're listening to the Locked On Mariners podcast. Thank you so much for making us your first listen. So the last question that I have on the GOAT conversation here for you, Colby, is it possible for a pitcher to be the greatest of all time in the sport? Not with the qualifier of greatest pitcher of all time, just greatest player of all time in baseball. Is it possible for a pitcher?
No, they don't impact the game enough. They pitch once every 5 days. Or if they're a reliever, they pitch 60, 70 innings a week. No, it's not possible. It's its own separate category.
Yeah, it has to be, right? And hitters play every day, or they play almost every day, right? And
just take the greatest pitcher of all time, whoever you think it is, Roger Clemens, Pedro, Randy,
Maddox, etc. Yeah,
sure, whatever, whoever, right? And ask yourself, would you trade prime them for prime Barry Bonds, for prime Mike Trout, for prime Griffey even? Right. No, you wouldn't, because those guys impact the game every single day.
Right. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Robbie Ray here. We talked about him on Monday. We got asked how he could get back on track and all those things, and that was met with some skepticism, I would say, in the comment section.
some buffoonery.
Sure, and especially in the Twitter replies.
Yeah.
Yeah, specifically in the Twitter replies, I should mention.
Sure.
I don't think that people realize just how good Robbie Ray was for a really good chunk of 2022. He was really good. From May 25th to about September 3rd, I was looking at it this morning. Dude was running like a 2.61 ERA. He was striking out 10 guys per nine. He was really good. He was one of the 10, 15 best pitchers in all of baseball for really the majority of the season. It's just when he was bad, it was really bad. And that skewed his numbers quite a bit. He had a FIP over 4. He had an ERA that was pushing 4, all that. You look at the overall numbers, not a great year for Robbie Ray. But when you really dive deep into these numbers for Ray, he had a much better year in 2022 than a lot of people give him credit for. And of course, the image of him giving up that home run to Yordan Alvarez is going to be burned in everyone's minds. And then that, start in Toronto as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, I look at these numbers. I think about who Robbie Ray has been over the last few years and how he's been willing and been able to find success in reinventing himself just kind of on the fly in a way. I have a lot of confidence that he's going to be significantly more consistent in 2023. Maybe it's, not a huge change in overall numbers, but I think you're going to see a more consistent Ray and that there's just going to be less blowups. There's going to be more outings where he's only given up 3 runs. And it's just, he just goes out there and does his job essentially. But yeah, I know you wanted to talk about Ray some more because you noticed this as well with some of our listeners. So what are your thoughts on him overall, his past year and how we kind of look at that and then, how that translates to this year?
Sure. You talk about the blow up starts. If you remove his 3 worst starts in the regular season, his ERA is 3.15, which is elite. It's maybe not elite, but it's great. It's legit number 2 territory. I think when people remember Robbie Ray, they think of him through the lens of Seattle signed the Cy Young Award winner. And in his first year, Robbie Ray was okay. So therefore he was bad. So you're starting your analysis from a flawed place because we told you last year, you're signing Robbie Ray coming off of a Cy Young season. You're not signing a Cy Young pitcher. Like that's just not how it works, right? Robbie Ray is going to regress some. And you could argue very strongly that Ray didn't deserve it the year he won it anyways. But regardless, your expectations were too high coming in. But again, you remove the three terrible starts, 3.15 ERA. And yes, I know you can't remove them. I get that. What I'm saying is that when Robbie Ray goes out there, there is an 80% chance you're going to get a good start from him. And that has value. I think there's also this idea that Robbie Ray's been bad for, every year of his career, except for the year he won the Cy Young. And that's not true because he wasn't bad this last year, but he also had some good years in Arizona. I think it helps to just kind of start with what is Robbie Ray? Like, what is the baseline Robbie Ray? And baseline Robbie Ray is you're getting a guy who's going to take the ball every 5th day. Robbie Ray has posted, every single start for the last 4 seasons. He hasn't missed one yet in 4 years. He's really only dealt with injuries once in his entire career. His numbers are extremely consistent throughout. You're talking about below 4 FIPs or right around 4 FIPs. You're talking about 11, 12 strikeouts per 9. And you're talking about, a guy who's posted multiple 3-4 win seasons and also happens to have a Cy Young on his resume. When you look at what Robbie Ray did, you brought up the numbers from May 25th or whatever. I had the numbers here from May to September 1, right? So basically eliminating April when he wasn't terrible actually in April, but in September
also there was that monsoon that he pitched in Chicago and all that. Yeah.
A game that never should have been played.
Yep.
But anyways, when you look at what he did, right, from May 1st to September 4th, I think, he made 22 starts. He covered 131 innings. He posted a 3.29 ERA, a 3.20 xFIP, and he struck out 10.76 per 9, walked 2.81 per 9. In that stretch, he was 12th in xFIP, 29th in ERA in all of baseball, not the American League. Robbie Ray was, during that stretch of time, He's a legit number 2. I mean, there's no sugarcoating it. He was a legitimate number 2 starter, went out there, took the ball every single day, every single time through the rotation, never missed a start. He was 24th in innings pitched during that time as well. So he posted, he went deep into games, he struck guys out. The only thing Robbie Ray really struggled with during that time span, which is what, 5, he struggled a little bit with his with the home ball, right? Command wasn't quite what it was the year before. We all kind of expected that to be the case. But when you look at the numbers and you peel them back and you look at the game logs and you go back and you watch Robbie Ray actually pitch last year, he was good for 90% of the year. He was worth his contract for 90% of the year. Unfortunately, because he was bad, in the last 3 weeks of the year, everybody thinks that he was bad for the entire year. It's lazy analysis or you're misremembering. It's one or the other, right? You're either trying to make Robbie Ray look worse than he was because you have an agenda and you're trying to put out this point that the Mariners wasted money on him, or you're misremembering because he was so bad in the playoffs that that's all you can think of. And that's not fair, because if Robbie Ray has these struggles in June and we're talking about how good he was from July through the playoffs, he was as good as he was from May to September, right? If he does that from July on, we're talking about Robbie Ray as a dark horse Cy Young candidate this year.
Right.
So it's unfair for Mariner fans to sit here and say, Robbie Ray is a bust, Robbie Ray is a bum, he was terrible last year, because none of that is true. And oh, by the way, Robbie Ray probably enters this year as your number 4 starter.
Yeah. It's like, I can get being disappointed with his year, being underwhelmed by his year. Sure.
Even that seems like a stretch to me, but
even that, you get into the deeper numbers, right? And it's a lot better than, it paints a more full picture here, right? Where really the big issues were isolated to a few sporadic instances.
Right.
It's just
they tended to bunch up too, right? Like if Robbie Ray had a bad start, it was typically he was going to have another one, right? Mm-hmm. He would get on these little rolls. It wasn't like one start here, one start here, one start here. It was like, no, he'd have like 3 mediocre starts in a row, but then he'd be great for 15,
Right. Yeah, especially that, that role that he got on when he re-implemented the 2-seamer and all that. I believe that began against Boston, or he started to throw it in that awful start against the Astros, but then he went out against Boston and shut Boston down. Had a couple of nice. What?
Do you remember what his what the final line was in that Houston start that was so terrible?
I think he only gave up like 4 runs, right? It was the 2 home runs that he gave up, and that was it.
Yeah. So that game that you're talking about was against Houston.
I think that was end of May.
It was on June 6th.
June 6th.
Yeah. Terrible Robbie Ray, right? 5 innings pitched, 4 runs, 3 of them earned, 3 walks, 3 strikeouts, 3 home runs, 3 solo home runs.
Right. And then, I mean, some of that was
in Houston.
Yeah. Some of what made that worse though was like he wasn't able to find the strike zone consistently, and like it was clear that he was.
Oh, it didn't look great.
Yeah. It was rough.
But if I told you that your starter pitcher went into Houston, faced that lineup, went 5 innings and gave up 3 runs, and I didn't tell you anything else, you'd be like, okay. Yeah. Not great, but I'll take it.
Yeah. Yeah. It was just the path to getting there wasn't great, but yeah. No, I get what you're saying though. It's just, I again, like you can be underwhelmed by it or whatever. Fine, sure, I guess, but that's also goes to the whole expectations conversation. And we were telling you last year, man, that like, that's just not who he is. He's not a Cy Young guy. Like he's not he might, work his way into one here, every now and then. He might work his way into the Cy Young conversation. He has that potential, but he's not a guy that, with his tool set, he's not a guy that can consistently find himself there. He's kind of like a super Andrew Heaney in a way.
Yeah.
Like he's kind of what everyone hopes Andrew Heaney can end up being.
Right. Just, he's healthy and he posts and he goes out there every 5th day.
Yeah.
And by the way, if you want to get even like more like meta with his stats, eliminate the outings he had against the Astros, and Robbie Ray is like a 4-win pitcher. Like that's how much the Astros dominated him. Now that is a problem that Ray has to fix because obviously he's going to face Houston. But they clearly have something on Robbie Ray. They have a really good idea and a really good game plan. Just to kind of, put a bow on it. The Astros against Robbie Ray last year, 442, 509, 865.
Jeez.
like,
Yeah. So
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and so that also plays into why I think, fans feel a little bummed out about this right now,
Sure.
is the fact that, the big free agent that you sign is really struggling against the team that you're chasing after. The target, your main target is beating up on this dude that you invested pretty heavily in.
Right.
And so,
Go
for him, this goes into the whole off-season conversation and taking the off-season to work on some things. He's got to work on how to attack that Astros offense, because whatever his game plan has been going into those starts is not working. And now, he's not going to get as many opportunities this year with the schedule changes. He might face the Astros like 3 times this year, just depending on how the schedule lines up. But he's got to figure out how to beat those guys.
Right, because it's not just the regular season. Like, you get 3 starts in the regular season, fine, whatever. If you plan on, going to the World Series, if that's your aspiration, you're going to have to beat the Astros.
Yeah.
Like, you're going to have to be the team that takes them out. Nobody's going to do it for you. So, I guess, at the end of the day, I would say, I guess if you're disappointed by Robbie Ray last season, there's nothing I can do to change your mind on that. I think your expectations were too high, and I think you're putting an enormous amount of value on his last 5 starts instead of the other 27. And that's just about timing. That's about bad luck. That's really not anything there. But like I said, if you're disappointed by Robbie Ray, fine. I mean, there's nothing I can do to change that. But I think you need to understand that Robbie Ray's entering, this season presumably as your number 4 starter. Whether he pitches 4th or whatever, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
He is behind Luis Castillo, George Kirby, and Logan Gilbert. No other team in baseball has a number 4 with as much upside as Robbie Ray. You're not overpaying Robbie Ray. Robbie Ray is not hurting the Seattle Mariners in the slightest right now.
So lastly here, we got asked a question a few weeks ago when we were doing Mailbag Monday. I was meaning to include it in our show, and then I just spaced on it. This came from a listener of ours named Brandon, at Brandon_SW4 on Twitter. And essentially his question, I don't have it here, but essentially his question was asking us to reflect on the James Paxton trade. This was right around the time that Justus Sheffield was DFA'd. Of course, Sheffield made it through waivers and was outrighted to AAA, so he's still within the Mariners organization. But his ability to get to the major league level is slim to none.
Yeah.
To be very, not
a lot of paths.
To be generous about it. Obviously, Erik Swanson was traded in the Teoscar Hernandez deal. And then Dom Thompson-Williams, the other prospect that they received for Paxton in that deal with the Yankees back in the winter of 2018 was, he got injured. He suffered a pretty big injury, and then it just kind of derailed his career, and he was eventually released as a minor leaguer a couple of years back. Looking at the WAR totals, not a big disparity between what Paxton gave the Yankees and then what Swanson and Sheffield combined to give the Mariners. 3.8 F4 from Paxton, 3 flat from Swanson and Sheffield. This is one of those deals where both teams didn't really get what they were hoping for out of this deal. Paxton, did pitch in some pretty big games for the Yankees, including a playoff game. And had some nice moments, but of course, got injured and eventually made his way back to Seattle, and you guys know the rest. So how do we feel about this deal now in retrospect? Now that it's more or less complete, we know that the Mariners get Hernandez for Swanson, so we still have to see kind of how Teoscar goes this year. But here I'll let you go.
The Mariners are going to end up winning this trade in terms of just WAR, because Teoscar is going to put up more than a 0.8. And I know people don't like it when you include, other players that weren't in the trade in your trade analysis, but that's just the reality of it. That's just the fairest way to do it, because the Mariners were able to extract value from Erik Swanson, both, on the field when he pitched for them, but then they were able to flip him for something that helps them now. That all counts towards what this trade allowed you to do, because if you don't make this trade, you don't have Erik Swanson to trade for Teoscar. See how that works? But they're ultimately going to end up winning this deal on WAR alone. But I agree with you. I think neither side really got exactly what they wanted, but I think both sides got what they needed at the time they did. Right.
Mhm.
Paxton was able to help the Yankees in a playoff chase. Great. Erik Swanson was able to help the Mariners in 2 playoff chases, including one where they actually made the playoffs. Right. So when you look at it, even if you want to remove Teoscar, right, and you say Paxton gave the Yankees 3.8 wins and Swanson and Sheffield only gave the Mariners 3, the Yankees win. Here's the deal, right? That 0.8 wins, how valuable was that going to be to the 2018 or 2019 Seattle Mariners? Nothing. It was worth nothing to you. How valuable would the little bit of extra in 2020 have been to you if Paxton was even healthy? Nothing, right? Those wins are empty in 2019 and 2020 because the team wasn't built around Paxton to compete for a playoff spot. Those wins don't have value to you in 2019 and 2020, whereas the wins that Erik Swanson were responsible for or gave you or helped you get in 2021 and 2022 were hugely impactful because you were in a playoff chase for both seasons. So again, neither side really gets exactly what they want, but each side, the trade did help each side make the playoffs once, which is pretty fair. And again, because I refuse to say that we can't include Teoscar Hernandez in this trade. Teoscar is going to be involved, presumably, in another playoff chase. So in reality, Seattle traded James Paxton, right, for 2 years of James Paxton and 2 years in which they had no chance to compete whatsoever, for 2 years of an impact reliever and during playoff chases and an impact bat, 1 year of an impact bat. So to me, this deal is still a good deal. I would still make it. Now, I don't know what other deals were on the table for James Paxton, right? We don't know. And I, as much as people want to say, oh, well, that's a bad trade, whatever, I still consider process at the time it was made. And at the time the trade was made, getting Justus Sheffield for 2 years of James Paxton, who had an injury history, was huge. Justus Sheffield was a legit top 30, 40, 50 prospect, somewhere in that range.
Right. I want to touch on something real quick that you said here, because I know people are going to hear that and take pause for a second on that James Paxton wouldn't have provided value in 2020. The thing that we have to keep in mind here, folks, James Paxton only threw 20 innings in 2020, only made 5 starts. Justus Sheffield threw 55 innings, made all 10 of his starts in the shortened season, posted a 3.58 ERA.
It was the 1 year he was good.
And he was worth 1.6 F4, which was 1.3 F4 better than Paxton that year. So, context matters in that as well. So, Right.
It depends on how you want to look at the trade at the end of the day, right? If you're just looking at it like Justus Sheffield was supposed to be a mid-rotation starter and he's not, so it's a bad trade. I mean, okay, that's
it sucks. It's disappointing. It's disappointing the way that Sheffield's career went after the promising 2020, but
at the end of the day, did the Mariners rebuild get furthered and did the Mariners come out on top in this transaction? Yes.
Yeah.
To me, it's not debatable. Yes. The Mariners, this is a good trade for the Mariners. Is it a great trade? No, of course not. A great trade would have been Sheffield giving you, 3-win seasons 5 years in a row. Didn't happen. But does that mean the trade is a disaster? No. The Mariners salvaged this trade, I think is a fair way to say it.
Yeah. I feel pretty good about the trade overall, in retrospect. And again, I am going to count Teoscar in this whole thing because it's a huge part of it. I mean, you essentially, Adam Macko is interesting and the Blue Jays really like Adam Macko, but Erik Swanson was the driving force of that deal, was the driving force of landing Teoscar Hernandez.
And you acquired that amount of club control for Swanson.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So this is why when we talk about why Jerry valued club control so much early on, this is part of the reason why. Because you have club control on Swanson still, he has value to a team who has something that you want. They're all connected. I mean, building a baseball team is not binary, right? It's not 1 + 1 = 2. That's not how it works. Sometimes it is, but a lot of the times it's 1 + 1 + 2 - 3 + 4. And you just kind of try and figure it out, along the way, and you connect the dots. So to me, this trade is, like I said, it's not a home run. I mean,
Yeah.
and we all love James Paxton. I was certainly sad to see him go, but I understood why. It made a lot of sense at the time.
And they were able to reunite with him. Obviously, that didn't go the way that anyone hoped.
Yeah.
But,
Oh, man.
But they were, and I think there is something to that as well, that, Paxton ended up leaving New York after giving them some value, but not a great ton of value. And then coming back to Seattle at the end of it, and there was a chance for a while there to have a rotation that included both Justus Sheffield and James Paxton in it. Not even 2 years later.
Imagine like a healthy James Paxton in 2021.
Yeah,
that team probably makes the playoffs.
Yeah, that probably adds at least a win to their total.
A win or two, probably,
which is essentially what they needed to break through there. So, yeah, that sucks to think about. Now I'm sad here as we
good job, Ty. Good job.
Yeah. All right, well, that's going to do it for our show. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Locked On Mariners podcast. For Colby Patnode, I'm Trident Gonzalez. Be sure to give us a follow on Twitter at LO_Mariners. You can follow me at Dane Gonzalez, DaneGNZLZ, and Colby at CPAT11, that's CPAT11. You can also find all that stuff in the description of this episode. And thank you again for making us your first listen. Now make your second listen. Locked On MLB Prospects. Host Lindsey Crosby is a prospect encyclopedia, and he's going deep on the MLB stars of tomorrow. It's free and available wherever you get your podcasts, just like us. And with that, have yourself a beautiful baseball day, and we'll see you on Friday. Peace.